And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is David Dayen. Dave Dayen is one of our best financial writers around, in my opinion. He is a contributing writer to Salon.com and to The Intercept. He also writes for The New Republic, The American Prospect, Vice, Naked Capitalism, a few others. And his new book, which I am holding now for those of you who are watching the video, is called Chain of Title: How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. It is available at a fine bookseller near you, even as we speak. Dave, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I know you've been working on this book a while. I know that giving birth to a book is probably a longer gestation period than an elephant's, but it came out great. I read it this week, and yeah, it's very, very readable. It's tough to make financial realities readable. You've done that through focusing on these three folks. Why? Let's start with this. Why were these three people important to the story?
Well, they were important because the particular set of crimes that I'm talking about, and what we're talking about is foreclosure fraud, which is different from some other types of fraud. It's really about the mass production of fake documents in courthouses and county recording offices all across the country in order to fake standing to foreclose in these cases. So people were evicted by the millions from their homes based on false documents. And in the book, it explains why banks had to resort to this tactic. And it was really these three people that were instrumental in uncovering this through their own research and through the establishment of blogs and websites that really exposed it. They put up depositions. They put up all kinds of evidence proving their case and really exposed the nation. And what's so interesting about it is that they weren't government officials. They weren't activists. They weren't really any of the experts of any kind prior to this point in real estate or finance. They were foreclosure victims. And they were rare among foreclosure victims, since 95% of foreclosure cases aren't even contested. But these guys decided to fight, and when they fought, they realized that their documents were irregular. And instead of just trying to fight their own case, they went to the public records and dug around and found patterns that they weren't alone, that this was actually a systemic practice. And then they found each other, and they moved forward from there.
Now, at the other end of the spectrum, when it comes to foreclosure fraud, we've seen tens of billions of dollars, at least on paper, tens of billions of dollars of settlements with the big banks for foreclosure fraud. They have, while not explicitly admitting to it, they've tacitly admitted to it in these fraud settlements and so on. What connects these three people digging up evidence with these massive multi-billion-dollar fraud settlements we read about in the newspapers?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key there, by the way, is on paper. I go into length in the book about why those settlements aren't worth that paper that they were printed on. But what these three people did was build this giant fact pattern to make it inescapable that this is what was going on, that there was systemically documents that were fake, that were being produced in order to kick people out of their homes. And these three really wanted more. I mean, Lynn Simoniak is one of the three individuals. They're all based in South Florida. She really triggered the investigation that was the only real criminal investigation of this misconduct out of Jacksonville, Florida. And that netted the only criminal conviction for any of this. And it was of a lady named Lorraine Brown, who was the CEO of a company, a third-party company that actually created the physical documents. It was called DocX. And the really stunning thing is that she was convicted of committing a conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy of one, because they claimed that she duped the banks by giving them false documents, even though that's what they were asking for. It's quite an incredible little sidelight to this whole thing.
And yet you also had cases where it seems as if the big banks, J.P. Morgan Chase comes to mind. They had a unit of temporary employees, mostly college students. They called them the Burger King kids, and didn't they do pretty much the same thing?
Absolutely, and yet they were not touched. It was sort of I described Lorraine Brown as sort of the Lindy England of this whole scandal. She was the scapegoat that ended up going to jail, even though you could easily have gone up the chain and implicated everyone at every major bank in the United States. So that's really one of the tragedies of how this turned out.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second. You make a great point. I think it's in the introduction to your book, which I'm holding here. But you make a great point, which is everybody keeps asking, why wasn't anyone from the big banks indicted? But while at the same time, everyone basically believes they know the answer to their own question, but they keep asking it, which is,
right.
Why is it that Jamie Dimon can run J.P. Morgan Chase and be lionized, in the halls of power, when some low-level functionary who contracted with banks like his is the only person to go to jail? And the answer seems to be corruption in the political system. Plus, I think, that notion that if you implicate the banks, it will have ripple effects for the economy.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly something that the banks said. That if you heard us, it's going to be a problem. I think one of that the book really wrestles with this issue, and it posits the fact that there could have been an alternative history. Because a lot of times what we hear is that, well, what was done on Wall Street was unethical, but it wasn't necessarily illegal, or it's very hard to convict, it's hard to get a jury to understand. Well, here's a case where 3 individual foreclosure victims did more evidence gathering and investigation than the entire breadth of the United States government, and they found these pieces, millions of pieces of documentary evidence that would not have been hard for a jury to understand. The juries understand forgery, and they understand fabricated and false documents and false evidence being planted in these court cases. But that road was not taken, and the question that I sort of try to bring out in the book is why wasn't that road taken? And there certainly is a lot of evidence that points to this desire on the part of Washington to create a global settlement to just sort of push aside this piece of misconduct and make sure that other agencies that were investigating it didn't go very far. There's the situation in Florida with the members of the Attorney General's office who ended up getting fired. They were working closely with my main characters, Lisa, Michael, and Lynn, and they ended up being fired, presumably because they got too close to actually piecing this whole thing together. There was another situation, a criminal conviction of another one of these low-level firms in Nevada that could have gone up the chain. And there was a very mysterious situation where the key witness in that case ended up committing suicide days before she was to testify. And so there are all these very strange things that happened. But a lot of the evidence points to the fact that Washington really didn't want to open this can of worms because it was a systemic practice. You really would have had to implicate every major bank executive in this country, and somebody wasn't willing to do that.
Right. And by the way, you also had the Attorney General of the United States, although he later walked the statement back, Eric Holder, saying, it would. You probably remember the exact words. I don't, but basically saying that if a bank is too big to fail, we can't prosecute banks that represent
too big to prosecute. Yeah,
too big. Which begs the question, and by the way, you can, of course, prosecute an institution as well as an individual, but it begs the question, even if J.P. Morgan Chase is too big to endanger with a prosecution, you can prosecute individuals within J.P. Morgan Chase.
Absolutely, and that road was not taken. They opted for these civil settlements that sound bigger than they are. They allowed everyone to go home and stand in front of a podium and talk about a big headline number. They said they reserved the right to criminally prosecute down the road, but to this day, there has not been one criminal subpoena that has been put forth by this vaunted financial fraud enforcement task force that was put together in the wake of this. So basically, you know, I don't think I'm giving away the end of the book that nobody went to jail and that no executive had to give back a penny of their bonus. And, you know, I believe that this remains an inspiring story about what three people with no institutional power or resources can do going up against the biggest and most powerful institutions in this country, but it's certainly more inspirational at around the 2/3 mark until you start to explain what Washington and Wall Street did to make sure there were limited consequences.
You know, is it fair to say, David Dayen, in the book is Chain of Title, is it fair to say that we know more now about bank foreclosure fraud and criminality than we would have had your three protagonists not done what they did?
Yeah, there's no question. And I mean, you know, this was bubbling up because the few lawyers who were willing to take these cases did, you know, get this out into the world. They were questioning the documents, they were questioning them in their own cases, and they were winning cases here and there. But Lisa and Michael and Lynn, they really did bring it to a mass level, and they created the conditions whereby at the end of 2010, all of these major mortgage servicing companies stopped foreclosing on people because they could no longer do it legally. And, you know, unfortunately, that was just a pause. And even more unfortunately, the same false documents are used in court cases to this very day. But, you know, one thing I say in sort of the epilogue is that, you know, movements like this, social movements, activist movements, they kind of crash on the shore, and each one gets a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And I really do think this was kind of a proto-movement that prefigured whether it was Occupy Wall Street or it prefigured the Warren wing of the Democratic Party or the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, this was the beginning of using sort of a networked way through the internet to collaborate, coordinate, and get the word out about, in this case, this Wall Street criminality. And it educated a lot of people, and it let them understand how powerful their voices can be when they raise them collectively. So I think they deserve a lot of credit, and one of the reasons I wrote the book is to ensure that their work was really honored.
Well, you know, I really appreciate that, and I think that's really well said. I think that that makes a great point. And there's one other area I want to get into, and then maybe ask you a couple other things, David Dayen. But in terms of the book, you know, in my own writing, I did a lot of research into, and your protagonists come up against something called MERS, MERS, and it's I think an interesting story, and I wanted to, you know, explore it with you a little bit. First of all, for those who don't know, what is MERS?
Right. So MERS is at the simplest level a tax evasion scheme. Basically, during securitization, there were all these transfers. So the originator of your mortgage, the person who sells you your mortgage, takes that and immediately sells it to a Wall Street bank. And then that Wall Street bank goes through a series of transactions, and eventually that mortgage lands in a trust. And there are bonds that are made out of that trust, and the proceeds from the monthly mortgage payment goes to the bond holders, the investors in the bond. All of those transactions, under a normal practice of property law that's been involved in this country for 300 years, all of those transfers would trigger the documentation so that we know who sold what to whom, and a recording fee so that the county records office can maintain these, which are public records, of the transfer of ownership. The banks did not like that. They did not like the idea, especially because you're talking about millions of mortgages, and maybe it's $50 a mortgage, but you're doing a number of different transfers per mortgage. That gets expensive, and it's time-consuming, and they didn't want to do it. So they created this system called MERS, which is a private electronic database where the banks, and banks fund MERS, by the way, along with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they basically track these transfers that they're making on these mortgages by themselves, privately, electronically. And what they do is when they initially sell the mortgage goes, is the nominee of the mortgage is MERS. And so they put it into MERS. And by the way, 60 million mortgages are in MERS right now. It's about 60% of the entire market. They're in this private electronic database, which is open to thousands of people and prone to much error, and it's all privately done. So the transfers are all done within MERS. And at the end of it, all the recording office sees is that the loan went to MERS. And so they don't see these other transfers, meaning that the banks don't have to pay for those other transfers. And that's why I call it a tax evasion scheme.
Well, that's part of it. But the other part of it that I think is important is that it prevents people like your protagonist from knowing who really owns their mortgage at any given time.
Right.
You know, that it's a shell company, too, that they protect. MERS, I think, had at one point 20 employees and 10,000 named vice presidents, all of whom worked for different banks.
You could actually purchase the MERS corporate seal on their website for like $25.
By the way,
you too could become a vice president of MERS, even though it's this company that's a shell corporation, as you described.
By the way, that I download a lot of their materials off their website. Including a training slide that showed how to foreclose on homeowners, and the sample homeowner was Harry Homeowner on One Poverty Lane in Jacksonville, Florida. That's the mentality of MERS, the shadow.
Right.
The shadow company that prevented people from knowing who really held their mortgage, which, by the way, is not only how we've done deeds in this country for 300 years, but knowing who you have a contract with has been a part of law since basically the Magna Carta. So
that's correct. And it's the bulwark of capitalism in many respects. There are economists that say that well-settled property law is the only reason that a capitalist society is allowed to function, because if there's a question when you're buying and selling property of who really owns it, then you have trouble selling that property, and things break down essentially. And this is sort of what separates developed from underdeveloped countries. And for some reason, the banking industry, to save a few bucks, decided that they wanted to corrupt our property system that worked fairly well for 300 years.
And nobody has. I was hoping that at some point during the fraud cleanup process with the government, somebody would say, hey, you can't do that anymore. But we did not do that, did we?
No, and MERS lives on, and there are conflicting different laws and rulings that have been made at the state level governing MERS, and really we've kept the process, because the property law process is really done at the county level, and so the federal government has kind of tried to keep its nose out of it, and that created the conditions so that the banking industry could essentially privatize the property law system in this country. And so now it just works sort of on an ad hoc basis, and every county is different, and that's true for foreclosure law more generally.
Yeah, it really is. And it's one of the reasons why people are mad as hell and not going to take it anymore. So, Dave, I wanted to ask you about it. First of all, I don't want to leave the topic of the book, Chain of Title, without strongly recommending it. Very readable. And we'll get back to it at the close. But you've written about a couple other interesting things lately, things that are close to my heart. One of the things you wrote about was the 1099 economy. and you wrote about that in the New Republic. Now, there's a lot of controversy about. First of all, I hate the 1099 economy. Like you, I've been part of it at various times. First of all, what do we mean by the 1099 economy?
Right. I mean, that's sort of a shorthand for the general rise in temporary, independent contractor, freelance work that has represented the entire rise of employment in since the Great Recession. The jobs that have come back, virtually, a great number of them have been these temp jobs, freelance jobs, independent contractor jobs. And the benefit to business, of course, is that they don't have to pay out things like overtime or vacation or any kind of benefits that normally would be accorded a staffer or a full-time employee. They don't have to do that with 1099 workers. 1099 refers to the tax code, of course.
Right.
That's what you end up getting.
So if it's Uber or if it's TaskRabbit, where you do that, whatever it is.
But it's more just that companies are designating their employees as freelancers and skirting that because we have our benefits linked to employment rather than universally given, that this is a way to sidestep that, and it saves companies a lot of money, and it puts the burdens sort of the safety net on the individual itself.
And on society.
To
the extent that society is willing to do it. So this also could include, in addition to, what people hear about the Uberization or whatever of the economy, this could include the guy who installs your cable, for example, could very well be a contract employee, and many of them are. So this spreads through a lot of sectors in the economy, and there's a lot of controversy. Maybe because people are focusing only on the Ubers of the world, on how big a segment of the economy we're really talking about when we talk about 1099 workers.
Right. If you're just talking about Uber drivers or the gig economy, which it's sometimes called, then it's a relatively small level. It's a relatively small number. But if you're talking about freelancers in general, that is a large and fast-growing segment of this economy, and it ought to concern people because we're undergoing, as we have in other ways, this great risk shift from the businesses to individuals.
Well, first of all, I hate the term gig economy personally because I was a musician, and when you got a gig, that was a good thing. But gig just means job, so I don't really know. It's not a term with meaning to me, but it is a term that
it means a short-term assignment.
Right, I see. Okay. Well, thank you. Actually, I just figured a gig is a gig. Okay, I got a gig. Lucky me. But in terms of your broader point about the risk shift, the great risk shift, this is what I think is so important. I'm inviting you to join me in philosophizing for a second here, which is a dangerous thing. But isn't it really part of, at one point our society had a kind of social or political balance to it that said corporate greed or the desire to maximize earnings was being checked by some social and political forces that don't seem to be in place now. So, of course, whenever they can, they'll eradicate pensions, they'll eradicate vacations, health coverage. They'll put you on whatever they can do, put you on a part-time basis or a temporary basis. What's
the best way to do that, the best way to accomplish that is to, as I think I put it in that story, atomize workers.
Right.
So you're breaking the ability for workers to be to employ collective power, because as freelancers, they're all sort of in competition with one another.
Right.
So you create this rugged individualism among the workforce, and that inevitably is going to benefit management over labor.
Right, and to me, the voice, the dark voice in all of this is the voice of economists like Tyler Cowen and columnists like Thomas Friedman who say average is over,
Right.
meaning I guess that, we're in Lake Woebegone where all the children are above average. But
Right.
but basically means exactly what you just said, David Dayen, which is that, when you put people in competition with one another and you explicitly say as an ideological statement, you are going to have to be much better than average in order to survive in the future economy. What you're really saying is, we all used to talk about the average person. What you're really saying now, you're condemning the average person to poverty.
Right, right. You're squeezing the middle class, and there was just a report out this week about how the middle is dropping all over in basically every region of the country, and you're having this increasing stratification with the rich and the poor, those sectors growing, and the middle falling out. And I think that the atomization of the worker in terms of this trend is a big part of that.
Well, there was a time when corporations either didn't want to do this, didn't think it. Think of the 1960s, right?
Get away with it.
Right. Well, that's my point.
Get away with it is the way you should look at it.
Yeah. Well, what changed so that they couldn't get away with it then, but they can get away with it now? Is it 40 years of Reaganite ideology penetrating the Democratic and Republican?
It's 70 years of the downgrade in unionization laws and labor laws that have taken the unionized sector of the economy from 1/3 to I think 6% or 7%. I'm not sure of the exact number, but obviously labor is definitely hurting in a big way, and that can't help but have an effect on wages and bargaining and benefits and compensation and the ability to do this. One of the big strikes that's happening right now with Verizon is around this, is around the outsourcing of good-paying unionized jobs to other countries, and also to have this itinerant labor force where they want to send their workers to different parts of the country for short-term assignments all over the place. And this is what business is able to get away with when we don't have a strong labor movement anymore. But what I try to come up with in that story is a way to get around this, to say we need universal benefits so that corporations can't commit and engage in this dodge where they try to get out of their responsibility to workers. And there's things like multi-employer plans that a lot of construction trades use, so that individuals can go from company to company but still maintain continuous benefit packages. That's the kind of thing that we have to think about, because ultimately, trying to get these workers reclassified, that's a long and somewhat torturous road. I think if we universalize benefits and separate them from the workforce in some way, but make sure that the management is paying their fair share on them, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, and I think those are all really great points, and to which I would only add, it would be great to see us reinvigorate the union movement too. I really feel,
of course.
Yeah. I mean, I really feel in a lot of ways we have reverted back to the 19th century. I mean, I really feel as if we've got robber barons in banking and the tech industries and some other industries. And I guess this is my last philosophical question for you. Do you agree with me that to a certain extent we may want to go back and review the struggles of the late 19th and early 20th century to figure out how to respond to, in of course a very different technological context, the struggles of the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This time has been referred to as the new Gilded Age, and there's certainly a lot to learn from that. But I think people actually are learning from that to a certain extent. I look at the low-wage worker movement, the Fight for 15, how successful they've been in parts of the country with an idea that was pretty much seen as unobtainable, not but a few years ago. And now you have two of the three largest states in the country moving toward a $15 an hour minimum wage. So this can happen, and it doesn't necessarily happen through a union, although the union movement, SEIU in particular, had a lot to do with funding the fight for 15. But this can happen when workers collectivize their voice and put pressure on management. You can get changes, and it's been fascinating to see. And just to revert it back to my book, because I'm trying to sell some paper. It's how whether it's using the internet or using the communication tools, it's how collective action can affect change. And I think that the people I profile in the book are sort of, they were an early adopter of that.
All right, David Dayen. Well, I'm going to give you the highest praise that I give anyone in the spheres in which we operate, which is you are knowledgeable and yet optimistic. So the book is Chain of Title: How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. And our guest is David Dayen. Dave, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for your interest.